Welcome back to Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren, ExoAcademian. Darren, it's good to see you again. I feel like it's been ages since we last recorded. I know you and I both recently had some travel away from home, and I think we both had excellent trips, spending some time with friends and family. It's good to be back home as well, and it's been a busy week, in my opinion, for the UAP UFO topic. But before we jump into some of that, anything you want to share about your travels?
Perhaps there is. Yes, I had a great trip up to the Pacific Northwest, northern Washington State, and into British Columbia. Mostly spent my time in the Vancouver area and saw some friends there. It was a great experience just catching up with people. It had been a long time since I'd been back there, probably 10 years, which is amazing. But one of the things I was planning to do, which did work out, is that there are some places that are much more progressive when it comes to psychedelics and whatnot. And of course, there's places in the West, in the U.S., like Washington State, Oregon, California. There's places where a lot of psychedelics are now completely legal. Slowly but surely, our entire nation is slowly moving towards normalizing the use of these things. Psilocybin, for instance, is much more readily accepted as a kind of treatment for depression and whatnot. That's slowly gaining traction, even in conservative states, I think. But it was really amazing to go to Vancouver and be able to go with a friend of mine to downtown Vancouver and walk into a store and be able to have, shelffuls of different things you can imagine getting. So I was really interested in trying DMT for the first time. So I have experience with psilocybin, and I've talked about that in the past. I've had really mind-blowing, mind-expanding experiences on psilocybin, but was really eager to try DMT. And to make a long story short, I did sort of 2 rounds of it. The first round was the sort of 30 milligrams, trying to get to what they call the waiting room, which was a crazy experience because you're actually trying to suck in this vapor that's being burned from a powder and turned into a vapor. And it's so fast acting compared to psilocybin that by the time you're finished taking the vapor, you're already feeling like your brain begin to really sort of phase shift into something else. And so then you lie down and you have the experience. And the first part was these crazy geometric shapes and everything in kind of earth tones, and also feeling a little bit of like out of bodiness to that. And then the second round was like 50 milligrams, which they call breakthrough territory kind of thing. And I don't think quite got the full 50. I think I probably got 45 because again, I'm not a smoker at all. And you're trying to suck in this vapor, which is, kind of burns the throat a little bit, but you're trying to do this before it escapes out the top of the pipe. Anyway, long story short, once it hit me, I had to quickly lie down because, it was hitting me by the time I finished basically. And that was a really amazing experience where basically the ego dissolved altogether. I had no sense of having a history. I had no sense of a course of events that are part of Darren King's life. None of that was the case. I just felt like I was a consciousness basically that was a part of the environment I was in. It was all shapes and geometric patterns and whatnot that were moving around me, undulating and things. And I really had no subject-object distinction. And I really had no sense of small self-ego. I had no sense of history. And because of that, I had no sense of time. So it was really profound. And at one point, I actually felt this presence, like an intelligence around me that was somehow distinct from me, almost surprised that I was there, almost that kind of feeling. And then I felt like this geometric shape wrap around me, almost like a blanket, and come really close around me. So it was a really profound experience, really glad that I had the opportunity to do that. And I hope that becomes more normalized in our society as well. But yeah, it was absolutely a mind-blowing trip in more ways than one.
Okay, yeah, your trip was a little bit more mind-expanding than mine was, perhaps. I'll give you that. I was in New York City, though, and had a wonderful time. And one thing that I love about New York, and I know you've been, is just the cosmopolitan quality of the city. And, you're talking about altered sort of experiences of reality. And for someone like myself who's from the South and has grown up largely in more suburban areas or even some rural areas, I lived in the city a little bit as well, but being in a city of that size where you can walk a single block and you hear 5 different languages being spoken. We had some amazing walks in Central Park, just observing people from everywhere. And honestly, it was incredibly hopeful and encouraging and optimistic to see humanity on full display doing what we do, just kind of being together and going about our lives and celebrating these individual moments. And it made me, reflect on just how much promise we have as a species when we can look past some of the petty differences that tend to divide us. And it was a reminder too, I think, that when you're forced to live or you opt to live in an environment that is full of different people from different backgrounds and histories and cultural frameworks and views of the world, when you're mingling with those kinds of experiences all the time, it changes you. It changes the way that you look at reality. And that's I think a big takeaway for things that we talk about on our show. How reality is really impacted by the things which we sort of surround ourselves with. And if we just give some of these other perspectives an opportunity, we can be rewarded with a tremendous amount of world expansion. And that's really satisfying.
Absolutely. And it's interesting how, of course, that adds to some of the division we have in our country, because the more cosmopolitan areas, the areas usually on the coast, right? It's not a coincidence, right? On the coastal regions, you have more interaction with international cultures coming in and mixing, and it tends to stir the pot, and you end up with a different stew than you do in the central parts of the country. And that leads to what we have now in terms of a lot of strife. But yes, I think that's an apt description or a metaphor for what we're going to talk about today, because we're talking about how new ideas blend into the culture and change it.
Exactly. A lot of good stuff to cover on this episode. And before we get into some of these specific items, I know folks are going to want to get your take on the NASA UAP panel and briefing that happened just a few days ago. My thoughts, honestly, I thought it was really great. I was encouraged by the number of academics and PhDs that were present and who were treating this pretty seriously, that were expressed a desire, at least verbally, to reduce the stigma and encourage further study. I thought that Sean Kirkpatrick's remarks were much better than the ones he provided at the earlier hearing, and his comment, of course, which has been making the rounds in social media about the metallic spheres being seen throughout the world, and in sometimes instances performing some pretty anomalous maneuvers. Like, that was a pretty big thing to say, and I think, like a lot of us, when things like that are said, we get a little frustrated. There's not like a tremendous degree of follow-up after that okay, wait, you just said there are these flying metal spheres, and that's not, like, wait, you're telling me these are real? Are they balloons? Like, it'd be interesting if somebody even asked that direct question. You didn't really hear that asked, but it seemed pretty clear, at least to me, from the context of his statements, that they weren't balloons, that they weren't merely balloons. So anyway, I thought overall it was excellent. It's a continued advancement of the topic in the mainstream, making it more palatable to discuss and express a public interest in this area. From an organization that, and I think this was even mentioned in the opening remarks, that has a very high popularity rating in not only the United States, but throughout the world. NASA is very highly regarded. So for an institution like this to come forward in a public way with such a show of force and interest, to me, if you're a UAP enthusiast, UFO enthusiast, like, you have to be happy that this has happened, and it should make you hopeful for where we are going. I know it's not as fast as some might like it to be, but to be honest, this is probably the speed which it needs to be. But what were your thoughts about it?
Did you just say go fast?
Oh, no.
Sorry. Yeah. Before we went on the air, we were talking about this, right? That people easily lose a sense of context here. because those of us fascinated by this topic, obsessed by it, you might say, are so into the nuances, so into the weeds with it on a daily basis that much of this seems like child's play to us. But when we really step back and think about where we are compared to where we were prior to 2017, it's a sea change. There's no doubt about it. I mean, NASA is the organization you want looking into these things. And those of us really familiar with the data are frustrated that SETI was our best attempt at trying to ascertain the existence of extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional or extra-conventional life in the cosmos. And so for them to say, there's clearly enough data that we're going to take this seriously, we're going to actually put together a task force within NASA and look into this data, is already groundbreaking, absolutely groundbreaking. Because if they were still under the old guard saying there's nothing here, there's no there, then they wouldn't even bother to form it to begin with. So that's the first thing to make note of, is just how different things are. Not only did we have the UAP task force, but now we have AARO, we have NASA doing their own task force, we have the White House doing their own investigation, not to mention what's going on internationally in other countries. So this is a massive shift from the way things have been historically. So we need to keep that in mind. And yes, this conference, this briefing was not full of just scoff. There was reference, like you say, to these orbs, and a lot was said in a short period of time there when you think about the implications, because he's saying basically, not only do these orbs exist and they seem to be anomalous, we're not sure how they're staying aloft, we don't see any signs of propulsion, but if they're metal on top of that, which they certainly seem to be by looking at it, then, that's some weight to that and doesn't just tend to float. And even if someone says, well, I don't buy the metal thing, I think they're just balloons, well, then he says things like making interesting maneuvers or something like that. And of course, balloons don't tend to make maneuvers. If they are blown in the wind, there's a very, predictable pattern that takes, that you can say that looks like wind patterns to me. But clearly he's seen some kind of evidence of sharp maneuvers that suggest some sort of intelligent control. And he said this is all over the world. So that's a lot, really. And like you say, it's much more than was said in the initial conference. So I think we should be encouraged. I think that some people are put off by the fact that it's been declared that experience or testimony will not be part of the mix. But of course, we have to realize here, we're talking about trying to persuade a very skeptical audience, a scientific group of people who have assumed there's nothing here. So if they're going to be persuaded, it's not going to be by narratives, no matter how much they are based in reality, and they are based in reality, but that alone will not convince these people. It's going to be hard data. It's going to be sensor system data corroborating witness accounts and things like that. And we are at a point in history with our technological innovation where we really should be able to have multiple sensor systems often backing up this data and corroborating it. So yeah, I think we should absolutely be encouraged by this. And I think also, as you and I talked before we went on the air, this is also part of the slow bleed, the slow acclimatization that I think has been underway since 2017, that this is not just about them coming forward to the public and say, hey, for the first time, we're taking this seriously. There's a bit of a play there because I think many of them do know there's something, and there has been something for quite some time. But by at least saying that, acting like, wow, look at this, there actually is some data, we're going to look into this, we're going to form some task forces. What that does is it slowly implants in people's minds that there maybe is a there, and that makes it a much easier transition towards actually confirming something later on. So I think this is all part of a play that is going to take numerous steps.
Yeah, completely agree. Giving permission to take it seriously. That's what this is really doing. And the more academics that cross that line, then the more will follow. We will get better data, better instrumentation. They talked a great deal about calibrating instrumentation. All of those things are things we should be celebrating. As glacially slow as that process might be, as you point out, we really have to go that way. We have to, because the world we live in isn't going to take a witness testimony on face value. They're gonna require many different platforms and corroborating pieces of evidence to really get there and be confronted with the reality of this phenomena. And I think that is what is happening. It is clear that is happening. It's just happening a little bit slowly. One other thing I wanted to point out is that he mentioned that there had been a briefing with the Five Eyes organization. The five intelligence, the five countries are part of that intelligence apparatus that we share intelligence with. Just another, in my opinion, another data point to show there is a there. You're not going to have a high level intelligence briefing with the four of your other closest allies on a subject that is entirely fantasy. That is, somebody's, crazy concocted idea that they've, twisted some congressperson's arm into throwing some time and energy and dollars toward. This is a very serious thing. And yes, there are actual drones. There are, drones that are in our skies from our adversaries. Drone technology is advancing. And there probably are some novel technologies that our adversaries possess and that we possess that are in our skies. But all that said, there is something happening. There is, in fact, they're there. And I think that we're really past the point, in my opinion, where this sort of fantasy argument holds any water, and it starts to look more like a conspiracy than actual reality. And I think it's worth pointing that out. And then the last thing I want to say about the hearing, because it was brought up and it's been discussed a good bit in social media, was the mention about harassment. So there was a little bit of a talk about the folks on the panel who'd been subject to harassment from essentially the people in the UFO community, is what I could ascertain. It was kind of difficult. They were a little bit vague as to where it was coming from and what the nature of the harassment was. But I think you and I are both want to be very clear that that's not okay. It's not acceptable to harass these officials and try to, shame them or strong arm them into believing or looking at something that you think they need to see. As everyone's grandma always says, you catch more flies with honey than you do with anything else. So that's the approach we should take here. We shouldn't be belittling people that are sticking their professional necks out to try to find answers.
Yeah, and that goes for both sides, right? It's not just the people who believe this and want to call the bluff of some of these experts and say, come on, do your job, admit that it's real. There's those people who need to settle down and let the people do the research. They have to really go through the effort of determining that there is evidence and present that, because that's what's going to persuade a skeptical public and a scientific community, not just because you say you think it's real and you've known all along. So those people need to settle down. But so too do the skeptics that say, what are you doing even looking into this? It's ridiculous. This is an X-Files episode, right? In other words, you get those kind of belligerent skeptics on both sides. So neither one is helpful. The other thing I would say too, I think you made a good point, and I want to draw an analogy here. When you talk about the meeting with the Five Eyes and whatnot, and I'm aware of different things that are happening internationally in terms of preparation for something that's coming. And I'll give you the analogy of when, during the Cold War, when we were worried about the Soviets launching an attack, what would make us nervous is not suddenly that missiles are leaving silos, but actually that our satellites were picking up movement of, tanks and rocket carriers and things like that, and troops moving, right? Those kinds of things. You see politicians going into directions where there's going to be they're going into underground facilities. Those kinds of things hint at what's about to happen, right? That's what you would see just prior to a nuclear launch. You would see all these signs building up towards this final thing, but it's the signs that tell you what's coming. And I would point people to that when they think about this notion of disclosure coming in some significant way, that what we're seeing here is that very thing. We're seeing the preemptive, initial movement across international borders that's hinting at this preparation for something. And that would not be happening if there was not a there. Again, like you say, it's not just that the data is there, but clearly there's a preparation for disclosing of that data in some way, some shape or form. Otherwise, these kinds of movements across international borders, different political factions aligning around briefing each other and whatnot, would not be happening unless that was for a purpose.
That's an excellent point. Well, very good. I think we're looking forward to more coming from that conversation from the panelists that participated. now that we know who they are. It's a lot to get excited about and to be looking forward to later this year. And of course, there, as Kirkpatrick pointed out, there is an official report coming from Arrow in just a few months. So that will be interesting to see as well as we get more and more data about what they are up to. One of the big challenges with this topic is, the way that it sort of confronts our notions of what is real or what we might expect the UFO phenomena to represent. And we've talked a good deal about some of this as well, just the way that we are all in a way primed to have a certain narrative expectation about what the arrival of a non-human intelligent species may mean for our world. We've all seen countless movies and TV shows that have gone through scenarios that we're all quite familiar with. And I think maybe sometimes we forget the degree to which that content is at the forefront of our mental image of what this may be, of what an unfolding of a disclosure of this nature may look like. And you and I have discussed at great length the fact that it's probably not going to be a lot like that at all, and how we're going to have to grapple with many different areas where our expectation does not conform to the reality of the situation. And so we're going to walk through some of those scenarios on this episode. And I don't know where you wanted to start with this one. So I'll let you kind of open the floor with what you think is maybe an initial area of conflict between our expectation and the reality that the phenomena may represent for us.
Yeah, when we were talking about this and following up on our previous episode where we talked about disclosure, because there are so many implications, ramifications, consequences to this, it really needed a deeper dive into some of the specifics of what this will look like as our civilization begins to metabolize this information. As you hinted at there, many of us intimately familiar with this topic have had years to work through the nuances, to actually experience some cognitive dissonance when we wanted to believe one thing until the data confronted us to the point where we said, well, actually it's something else, or it's just too complex for me to even understand. I know that a line that Jeff Kripal came up with that I love is refuse to land, right? Refusal to land. It's very tempting to want to land in all sorts of areas in this topic, but because it so eclipses our understanding, not just of what these others may be, but what reality is, full stop, I think we have to keep an open mind, be willing to explore different avenues, but also recognize there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot we don't know that we don't know. So these are things to keep in mind. The challenge is, in the general public, people don't tend to think that way. They tend to immediately go with a gut instinct reaction. I believe that's true. I think that's fake news, right? This is what happens in our culture right now. So you take, again, the consideration that we've had years to metabolize this information and work through some of the nuance. And I think many of us, even when you think back over the last few years, you almost see this evolution on UFO Twitter from extraterrestrial to interdimensional to ultra-terrestrial, right? So you actually see this kind of evolution as people grapple with the data and say, well, it's kind of like that, but then there's this data that says somehow this is part of the picture too. And then you bring in psi phenomena stuff and near-death experience and out-of-body experience and how that's related. How psychedelic experiences sometimes put you in the presence of beings that seem a lot like the beings that supposedly are doing abductions. What does that say about reality? So many intriguing questions. And you think about that complexity. You think about even how abductees/contactees/experiencers often also have memory of previous lifetimes, sometimes even memories of having different forms, sometimes people even believing that they were a gray alien in another lifetime, or that they even now have kind of a dual identity. Susie Hansen wrote this book called Dual Soul Identity, which is all about that. So these are notions that the general public is not prepared for. They're thinking it's either going to be Star Trek or Independence Day, right? Those are the kind of the templates we have. And whenever you see alien movies in the mainstream, they tend to be quick confirmation about one of our assumptions, and then the action plays out. The movie is not 2 hours of mind-blowing, what does this mean, and what is reality, and who am I? Who are we? But this is actually what's entailed in this. So yeah, we wanted to spend some time going into each of these, some of the different implications of this, and the different areas that inevitably get raised in the midst of grappling with this. And when you think about just how mind-stretching this is and civilization challenging this is in terms of our reality construct ultimately, you can see why, again, not to excuse the secret keeping up till now, but you definitely recognize, if nothing else, that it's a complicated matter, and that considerations around how to release this without destabilizing the construct, because we have economies that run on fear and greed. And so if you suddenly inject a lot of fear into the system, and the system is not built to withhold and sustain that kind of terror that could exist across the culture, then you really do give some great thought to how do we do this in a way that moves us forward but doesn't completely panic people. But again, I just want to quickly add here that I think those of us who are familiar with this topic also have this sense that, and this is true for many experiencers, it's certainly true for me, that the status quo is not sustainable anyway. So even if it means there's some serious destabilization, in the long run, to me, that still seems like the lesser of two evils.
Yeah, I love the term that you use, metabolizing the information. I think that's a good way to think about this, that it takes time to work through the various implications of this phenomenal experience in order to find some footing, right? Because really we need a frame of reference. We need something that we can stand on to then build off of, right? So at least we have, to some degree, we have these existing narratives, like you said, Independence Day, or what was the other one that you used? Star Trek. Yeah, Star Trek. Those are great comparisons. At least we have those, because I think they aren't terrible jumping off points. I mean, they in a way kind of epitomize those sort of base human fight or flight instincts, right? Off which we have to make decisions, and we're going to have to make decisions in the face of some of these revelatory announcements that may be coming in terms of what they mean for us personally and communally, et cetera. And some of those decisions are going to be wrong. Let's be clear about that, right? Some of the initial decisions that we're going to make in reaction to this reality are going to be wrong, and they're going to, sort of spawn conclusions or lines of inquiry that will be dead ends. That, and in many ways, the community of interest can maybe help with some of that navigation, right? We can say, yeah, we've explored that idea. This is what it tends to lead toward, or this is the evidence that kind of supports that way of thinking, but also consider this alternative as well. So helping in a way, kind of being digestive aids, right, for the larger community of interest, that are the global community, as they get acclimated to this reality, I think is a really important task that is before us. But it is so abstract, right? I think you're talking about psychedelics at the onset of the show is a good, sort of comparison point there, because when you're in that kind of state of mind, it's so abstract and disassociative from your normal waking state that you go through a process of acclimatization and meaning making that you generate as the experience progresses. You don't enter into that experience and go, oh, I mean, this all makes sense to me. Like, I've got these swirling things happening, and that's not how it works. You really have to sit with the experience, and then it begins to sort of take a kind of form and a meaning that is really quite personal to you. And I think that is something that we will see occur. And that said, we're still going to have areas that we're going to be completely ignorant toward, because, as we've talked about many times, we don't have an experience of reality that is close to the actual truth of reality. We have an interface, we have an approximation, and so when reality is so incredibly strange beyond even our ability to comprehend it, we're naturally going to get a lot of things wrong. There'll be some translation error in trying to understand what that means. So what, with all that said, what do you think some of the big challenges are here for, human beings as this kind of becomes more and more widely accepted? What's one of the biggest hurdles to overcome, do you think here? Like just the extraterrestrial notion that it may not be that, or that physical reality isn't exactly what we thought it was. What's the biggest sort of tectonic shock here that you think is happening?
I think if there's one thing that stands out to me, it's that this will demonstrate to us how little we know. Because up until now, we're the lone wolf on the scene with the apex intelligence. At least that's how we've looked at ourselves, right? So suddenly, when we're presented with this knowledge that not only are there other sophisticated intelligences on the scene, but they eclipse us many times over to the point where they fairly effortlessly have been able to conduct their affairs, including interacting with human beings and running hybridization programs and whatnot, with us being largely unaware of the entire thing, which we think about, as parents, you can fool your 5-year-old, right? It's harder when they're 10 or 15, but when they're 5 years old, you can really fool them, and they are convinced of these miraculous things that you're able to do as adults. That's kind of how I think a lot of people are going to feel. They're going to feel like 5-year-olds who are being schooled by these much more sophisticated intelligences. So that's the first, I think, real monumental fact to metabolize. And I think a lot of people even now, and this surprises me because this is not the way that I'm built at all. I like mystery, but a lot of people just don't even want to talk about this, not so much because they're not interested, but to my surprise, it's because it just kind of scares them. They don't feel good about the notion that there are other beings so much more sophisticated than us that they can do things and we have no control over it. When they hear about hints that they can control our behavior patterns, and I've had that experience, right? And even control our perception. Many people will say, well, what are we left with? Right? There's not going to be a war here between the aliens and us. They can control our behavior and our perceptual states. Then it's game over before we begin, especially if they, like you say, have a fight or flight response, and this immediately triggers their fear of the other, the unknown, right? This is the unknown to the nth degree, and it's a highly sophisticated unknown on top of that. So a lot of people are just going to have fear as a response because it doesn't fit into the Independence Day or Star Trek variety. In fact, it shows us how silly those notions are when confronted with a reality that's much, much more complex. So I want to get your take on that too. But that's one thing that strikes me right away, is that I'm wired in such a way that, as you can probably tell by the things I do and the way I conduct my affairs, I pursue mystery. It's what makes me feel alive. But for many people, anything that is unfamiliar is almost immediately scary and intimidating and something they want to deny. So that's also something we're going to have to wrestle with as we metabolize, is there'll be large segments of the culture, even when presented with evidence, will choose to deny it, because we already see that happening in our society today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know to what degree that we have a framework to even operate within to begin making sense of it, right? We live in a time where our meaning-making models are kind of busted. That there are, most folks don't have one really to begin with, or what they operate under is some sort of kind of like consumerist, capitalist, entertainment, rat race or hamster wheeling of life. And, if they're not entertained on a regular basis, or if they don't have something to be outraged by, if you dig underneath that layer of reaction, I guess it's that surface layer of reaction that everyone kind of operates under. If you get below that, there's not a lot of substance there. It's not like there's a lot of people, in other words, who have done the real, meaningful, difficult work on understanding who they truly are, who we are as individuals, who we are as the self, that inner work. We're really good at everything that is on the surface. we're really good at evaluating the externalities of our world. We're horrible at the inner exploration. And the truth of the matter is that it's the inner exploration that is the most important factor, and I think is central to what the phenomena represents in its totality. And this is something that our greatest traditions, are the pinnacles of human of thought, philosophy, civilization. That these are conclusions that have all been sort of arrived at independently in different civilizations throughout the world and throughout our human history. So I think we need to look there and kind of redeem some of the understandings and the wisdom that we worked really hard, honestly, to get to. We need to revisit that and digest that in order to really be in a place where we can appropriately grapple with the weird, wild vastness that the phenomena represents. And I'm struck by, where do you begin with that? It's not like we have a world that is sort of eagerly hanging on the words of a wise teacher, and when they can issue a pronouncement of some kind, we're going to go, oh yeah, that's really that's meaningful and insightful, and I'm going to sit with that and make and really help that. I'm going to use that to guide my decisions and thinking. No, we're going to look to who are the talking heads, who are the folks on reality television, and what they're going to do when they react to, oh my gosh, we're not alone. We're not the apex species. There's, vast intelligences. They've been here all along. I mean, you can only imagine the reactions that some of these, sort of pundits will have, and how that will, in a way, kind of spin out of control in our world, because we just haven't done the work. We're really kind of shallow people, unfortunately, and it's time for some depth.
Absolutely. And I think I wholeheartedly agree with that. And while we can rightly blame some of that on the nature of our society, we have a 9-to-5, 5-day week work culture, many people just struggling to pay the bills and stay above water. So much of that is true. There's systemic issues that we need to address. Again, I've talked about some of those before. But nevertheless, we also have to have this individual reckoning, I think, where we recognize that if you had the time and the energy, would you use that to grow your interiority? Would you really pursue the depths of who you are? Would you explore the inner space of what it is to be human as much as you are open to exploring outer space in terms of what NASA is looking into? These are really key questions, and I think people will be confronted by them in ways that will make them uncomfortable. Because, to touch on something you hinted at the outset of the show, we already, in what we think of as reality, there's now all sorts of evidence suggesting that is actually just a perceptual interface. So that's the first thing people will have to metabolize, and that is already massive. We look at the work of people like Donald Hoffman, who've pointed out that what we basically are dealing with is a reality construct that is actually the fruit of the evolutionary process that gives us shortcuts, icons on an interface, if you will, to allow us to navigate an underlying reality that we don't usually interact with directly, and that is so complex and multifaceted and would involve a bombardment of so many sensory inputs that it would be completely overwhelming. So what evolution by natural selection has basically done is given us a fiction, a constructive fiction that allows us to navigate and stay alive and propagate the species, but is not a pipeline into the truth of the underlying reality whatsoever. When you really sit down and think about that, that already is a huge shock to the system. That, again, the point of evolution, the end goal, has nothing to do with showing you what really is. When we talk about the blue pill and the red pill in the Matrix, evolution is not your friend in that sense. All it wants to do is keep you alive. So if you believe that's a juicy red steak, then all that matters is that it keeps you alive. It doesn't matter what it actually is underlyingly. So that's a huge one, because what's interesting is, again, and I hinted at this earlier, sometimes when people have these different kinds of experience, altered states of experience, whether it's a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience or a psychedelic journey like I just had, or an encounter with beings that seem to take you into an alternate realm, or maybe it feels like sometimes you don't go anywhere and yet everything changes. It's like a different dimensional wavelength you enter into, like changing a radio station. And the fact that all of these different kinds of encounters and experiences bring with them this sense of that being more real than real, that being more real than this. So think about that. Not only that people have to reckon with the fact that there's these highly sophisticated intelligences in our midst, but on top of that, that what we've thought of as reality is actually a subset of something much more complex that we have not really dealt with directly. And these beings, in their sophistication, can run circles in those deeper structures and be able to take us into these different realms that we don't even know what they are. We don't have no concept of them other than when you experience it, you know something's different and somehow it's more real. You come back here and you actually feel this, rather than being, oh, I'm happy I'm home, you often have this feeling of, actually, this feels kind of fake and like a construct. It doesn't feel like it's the base reality, and yet all of these other experiences do. So there's so much when you think about what to do here, because it impacts every single area. You know, like who we are as a people, why we're here, what is the purpose of life, what is life and death, how are these beings connected to us? There's so many things to think about. But for you, how do you think about, let alone the whole alien question, but just the question around what is reality and how the nature of these experiences immediately bring that question in some ways more front and center than the question of who these others are, at least initially?
I think that's going to be the biggest struggle, is this realization that my physical instantiation, everything that I think I know of who I am, what life is, what death is, all of those things are just an overlay onto some sort of deeper structure. It raises a whole host of questions that I don't know that I'm or most of us are prepared to even entertain. Questions of identity and self, of the persistence of self, of agency, of relationships, duality. I mean, all of these things are come into play here. The thing that came to mind as you were just talking there, that I think, for me at least, helps illustrate the sort of strangeness of it all, perhaps, is that, while it is true that we're finding that evolution as a process does not exactly lead toward organisms that have a representation of reality, a true representation of reality. In fact, it's the opposite. Well, it's possible that these intelligences don't even operate within the realm of the physical theory of evolution at all. That there may not be for them that kind of evolutionary limiter, and for them the reality is as it is as it truly is. And evolution for us is just really kind of a byproduct of our physicalist, materialist investigations. It's a useful discovery for us in this world that we operate in, but in and of itself is there's no law that says it has to be the case for entities that may exist, at a deeper level of reality than where we find ourselves. So that juxtaposition of strangeness alone is quite jarring. That there are these potentially these entities that, and we talked about, of course, there's a great span of entities, perhaps that some which are like us, similar to us, and have evolved and may have the same kind of evolutionary limitation on the way that they perceive the world. But there may be other entities that don't have that, and so it's quite a lot to really. This is no easy task, and I think that's kind of what we're landing on here, is that it's not something you can necessarily hand a person a one-pager and be like, here you go, here's this one little easy to digest understanding of reality as it truly is. I don't know that we're going to arrive there. In fact, we're going to require And maybe, honestly, you and I are part of this endeavor where we're going to require, sort of pioneers and adventurers and not necessarily astronauts, but intronauts or something, people that are willing to figure this out and to stumble our way forward and push the boundaries of what is actually out there in order to come back with some learnings and wisdom that we can share with other people and help make their journey a little easier. So to me, it's a daunting task, but a lot like you, I like mystery and I like the challenge. And I think that's one of the things that's so attractive about this subject generally, is that it's a gateway, a door into these most fundamental questions. And as someone who's grown up around valuing that kind of thinking and philosophy and theology, I mean, it's very enticing. Yeah, that's what I'll say about it.
Yeah, I was thinking about the analogy of the Truman Show when you were talking about that there, because I think, again, a lot of people are under the assumption that, in fact, you hear this said a lot, most Americans already believe that extraterrestrial life exists, so not a big deal. Just add that cherry on top of the cake that we've already developed to describe and model our reality. But actually, this is much more like the Truman Show, because this revelation is like pulling the proverbial thread on the sweater. I'm thinking of a great Weezer song from back in the day, where inevitably the whole thing unravels. And then it's like the Truman Show. It's not just one more piece. You recognize the entire thing to some degree is a narrative fiction, which has been useful, but it's brought you to the precipice of an entirely new phase in human existence, where we are confronted not just with the proverbial other, but we are presented with an understanding that everything we thought was real was actually partial and really a fiction, a useful fiction, as you say, but nevertheless a fiction. And that some of these beings may be evidence of beings that actually at the end of that evolutionary trajectory transcend physical reality altogether, what we perceive as physical reality. Again, this is the thing. Every time you talk about this, you're constantly qualifying the terms you use, because when people say, well, is this happening in physical reality? My question is, well, how do you define physical reality? Because again, as I've said many times, people like Nima Arkani Hamed, these world-leading physicists, are saying space-time is largely illusory. It's a secondary byproduct of some deeper structure. And you can already see evidence that it's not a real thing. It's actually largely an illusion. It's a persuasive illusion. And we've, again, evolved around it in such a way that we have this relationship with it. But nevertheless, there is a deeper structure from which you get things like quantum theory and space-time. So when you recognize that these beings are so sophisticated that they're probably long been aware of that, and they're actually working in these deeper structures, and that if you think about that, really changes the question, because it's not, do they have physics that goes beyond our understanding of physics? It's recognizing, as Bernardo Kastrup likes to say, physics is the study and measurement of our perception, not of reality. I'll say that again. Physics is the study of our perception, not of reality. So when you start recognizing how small and truncated and limited our understanding of what we think reality has been, and that what this revelation, these series of revelations, will bring to bear is a completely new understanding of what it means to be a being in a reality that we've not dealt with directly before. And that furthermore, in fact, when people have had these experiences like out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, psychedelic journeys, encounters with these others that take them into alternate realms, that actually is closer to the base reality than what we think about as our waking consensus experience. And how much will that blow people's minds to recognize that our usual state is actually the illusion? That is the dream state. And some of these other ways and means can help us experience more of a base reality, and hence why it feels more real. So again, I wanted to be able to highlight some of this to make people realize just how deep down the rabbit hole this goes. There is no way to quickly metabolize this, and not really a way that you can even plan to, okay, we're going to have some destabilization, then we'll within 3 months, we'll be back to where we were. Again, it depends how it rolls out and what's involved in that rollout. But really, this has the seeds of a complete rewrite of our understanding of reality, and therefore undoubtedly of our civilization, the structure of our civilization, which again, I would argue is necessary. So I see this as a good thing, as much as some people will feel intimidated by all of this. I also just want to quickly say one last thing before I turn it back to you to discuss the next nuance we can bring up, because there's many. But that is that I just want to remind people that you can be in the presence of a intelligence that seems so much more sophisticated than you, that can think 100,000 times more quickly than you. I've had this kind of experience where you feel like the 5-year-old, and that's maybe an insult to 5-year-olds, because you feel so much like you're being eclipsed by this intelligence. Its relationship with space and time is completely different. They basically transcended that. You feel like they have to speak in such a dumbed down way to even communicate with you. But in the midst of that, and you feel that immense, powerful presence, that sophistication, and yet also feel completely comfortable, like get to the point where you feel completely comfortable. I've had experiences where there's so much information pouring through me when I'm in this kind of communicative state that it feels like you're dying. It feels like that. And that's why it's actually, I would suggest, it's helpful to practice things, whether it's Buddhist meditation or whatever, to begin to transcend your own sense of ego, because the more you're familiar with doing that, the less attached you are to a certain body-mind kind of consideration of who you are based on a history of, I'm this person, I was born to these parents in this place, this is who I am, sum total, that's it. The more you're attached to that, the more it's going to be discombobulating to deal with these revelations. The more we can actually prepare ourselves by beginning to transcend the ego, to recognize and actually practice even different ways that we can experience that, learn to familiarize ourselves, learn to normalize that for ourselves, the more this will be easy to metabolize. But again, like you hinted at earlier, the way our society is structured right now, many, many people have not even begun that journey.
I'm thinking about the past that we ignored and could have gone down in our history that we never did. That take a lot of our greatest religious teachers and the wisdom that they gained, and how their teachings often were distorted and twisted and really kind of commoditized, and we've certainly seen firsthand some of the abuses that have been born from a misapplication of the teachings from our greatest traditions. But I wonder, what would human civilization look like had we actually heeded the advice there and gone down a different path? And maybe this is an opportunity for us to come face to face with that choice again. And what will we choose? We are so wedded to the world that we have now, and wedded as being too generous, quite frankly, because that implies a degree of choice. We in a way have enslaved ourselves to the world that we live in now, and many of us feel trapped. Right, there is a sense that we've made a bargain by which we cannot escape. And perhaps this is an opportunity for us to do things differently and to imagine a different world. I think that's what's the most challenging to even get your mind around, is conceiving of a world of other human beings that live, breathe, and operate with a totally different set of parameters and incentives and behaviors. Talk about a foreign, alien experience. I mean, it's hard to even understand it, conceive of it, and that is perhaps what the confrontation with the phenomena, the being presented with its reality, may force us to do. But there will be the denialists, of course, the escapists, and I'm not going to pay attention to that. I want this world that I have. So I don't know. I'm also, I guess, in this discussion, I'm deeply curious about the way in which the interaction from the others, like, it feels very almost violating to know that these others have been with us this whole time and can experience you and I and everyone in ways that we can't even understand ourselves. It feels like a violation of our privacy. It's but I don't know if we can kind of explore that to some degree, because we've definitely talked about how this manifests itself in things like the experiencer accounts, that where many of the experiencers will initially have a sense in which they've been abducted, they've been violated, they've been taken against their will. Later on, they may contextualize that in different ways and may understand it in a different facet that is enriching and adds to their life and isn't viewed in a negative context anymore. So, is that a good sort of way to think about this? That maybe humanity will, as an on-ramp, kind of go through a similar stages of not grief, but of coping with what this reality may be like?
It's a good question. And just to refresh people's minds, for those maybe not so familiar with this aspect of the data, I know people personally who've been through this experience, and you see them go through this process of metabolizing this for themselves. So for instance, back in the 90s, when John Mack was working with people who had these abduction experiences, just again, put yourself in their shoes. There was no baseline for this. This was not something that you could look up in the encyclopedia set that existed at the time or the burgeoning internet. This was a complete unknown. The idea that apparently physical in every way beings were manifesting in your room. You have no idea how they got there. They seem to just be able to go through solid walls. And when they interact with you, it's very clear they're physical beings. This is not just a projection. This is not a hallucination. And yes, you feel that initial violation of, I don't remember inviting you in here. And on top of that, you're telling me we're going somewhere and you're going to take sperm or eggs and you're what? You're doing some sort of hybridized species experiment. And then I have to come back and try to tell the world this story. I have to try to get people to take me seriously. Just think about how discombobulating that is, not just the initial nature of the experience, but how no one's going to take you seriously. And nevertheless, the vast majority of the time, these people, given enough time for reflection and getting past that initial post-traumatic stress response, come to value these experiences and feel like they've been given a great gift where they've been able to see much more of reality, to have been able to come into contact with beings that really put into proper context how limited we are and how much, on a positive note, how much potential we have to grow and change and become much more than we see ourselves as being now. Because this touches on what you mentioned earlier. Our biggest problem is a lack of imagination. The reason why our society doesn't change at a greater clip than it does is because we just have a lack of imagination. And so, like you say, many people feel kind of stuck, but they don't know how to change it. And to some degree, we also excuse ourselves from being culpable that the same system keeps continuing. I understand on the one hand that we feel helpless in some ways, but are we really all doing the best we can to whatever small way we can move the needle forward? Are we doing that? Or are we just throwing our hands up and saying, well, it's not my problem really because I'm not the one in charge anyway? And is that really how you would go about things if you really felt in your deepest bones that that's what needed to happen? But yeah, these people that have these experiences eventually come to not only change their opinion of these others and metabolize and begin to normalize a sense of this is reality. It's much more than we thought of reality before. But on top of that, and this is again the part that is mind-blowing on top of mind-blowing, a whole different level here, is that they even begin to see themselves differently. And they begin to, for instance, very often have memories, greater awareness of somehow being a participant, a willing participant in this process, having memories of prior to birth, having conversations, meetings around coming into this world, incarnating, having a mission. So this question around what is actual violation here versus what is volition becomes very, very complex, because the very way we've defined a self that can make decisions on behalf of itself gets expanded, right? The borders, not only between nation states, but between ourselves and everything else and everyone else, also begin to blur. So the implications are immense. But yes, I think you make a good point that we're going to go on through that as a collective as well. We'll go through those different aspects of this grieving process. First of all, just having to recognize that what we've thought of as reality, things that felt familiar and like apple pie and American flags, things we grew up with, are not going to be our new understanding of reality. And at first, we are going to feel some sense of violation because, like you say, we feel a bit duped that we didn't know this was going on. We also feel like when evidence is presented, which I think it will be in the long run, that there's been some, if not seeding, then definitely control and manipulation of our trajectory as a species, even genetic manipulation en masse. Some people will not like that. They will feel like tagged animals, that the same way that we, breed puppies to be what we want. But again, that really comes down to recognizing we are not the apex intelligence. And for me personally, I know some people have a problem with this, but for me personally, when I've been in the presence of some other intelligences that are much further beyond me, I trust that more than I trust myself. And I know some people will say, well, you're just surrendering your volition there, like it's game over. Again, even my sense of self becomes expanded. So it's not as simple as it was before. So the equations get completely changed. That's what occurs to me here, not just for individuals, but for the collective as well.
That's it's like an ecstatic experience. I mean, it's like you said, it reshapes the entire way you understand who you are, what the world is. And we have examples of this, and I know I'm kind of continue to dip back into this well, but that's because it's familiar to me, and I think it's also a very useful well to draw from, and that we have a lot of anecdotal stories from our religious traditions of experiences that are just like this, and those traditions wouldn't exist without individuals who encountered other intelligence beyond them. We called them angels, or we called them, God, quite frankly. But really, it's something that doesn't fall into those neat categories. It's just something that is outside of a human instantiation, a human intelligence. But when you encounter it, and when you enter in a relationship with it, you're at a loss for words. You are doing the best you can to transcribe what it feels like in that moment, and the way the world has been transformed in that moment. And you're going back to your colleagues, your friends who haven't had the experience at all, and you're saying, well, it was like this, and it's like that, and this is what I think it means, and this is how we should live our life. And you're getting a lot of just dumbfounded looks. Maybe and maybe you lose friends, quite frankly. Most of the time you did lose friends in that process. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to listen to you anymore, because they like the world that they knew, and what you're telling them is a world that is unfamiliar, that is foreign, that is alien to them. And so I'm of the opinion that for true transformation to occur, human beings are going to need an experience like that on a very personal level. We're going to need not just a statement that comes from an authority that helps us understand this is real, but an experience of this otherness that is more real than real. And only in that experience, are we, I would argue, kind of able to be truly transformed. Now, you and I have talked about other time is that there are different methods by which we can have that kind of experience, even if we don't have an alien landing on our front lawn or coming to see us in the middle of the night. There are ways that individuals right now, without that happening to them, can cultivate an experience of otherness that is approximate or similar to what this is like. And I would encourage individuals to do that because it does transform you. And so how do we, in lieu of the others taking direct action, like I kind of wish they would, how would we sort of encourage or recommend an entire world to take that kind of journey after a press release, right? I mean, it just seems like a really challenging thing to ask people to do.
Indeed, and I'm glad you brought up religious history, because we haven't touched on that much. But like you say, ironically, this has shaped Western civilization. As many historians have pointed out, you cannot separate the development of Western civilization and everything that's brought with the fruition of technological innovation. You can't separate it from Christendom. You can't separate it from Christian Europe having a certain view of an ordered universe designed by God that would allow us to study it, learn from it, and develop technologies to manipulate it and to move ahead and to mirror our image of God by taking control and dominion of everything around us, right? These kind of religious terms we use. We think back to things like the Star of Bethlehem, right? It sure sounds like an anomalous object to me. Lights in the sky, right? Did Moses come back and say, wow, I just had a crazy anomalous experience? Probably didn't use those terms, whatever the Hebrew equivalent is. But nevertheless, like you say, this is what was happening. And it's funny because we, again, in kind of our lazy thinking, we tend to think of these as different categories. Oh, well, now you're talking about religion. Well, no, we're talking about, like you say, people coming into contact with apparently non-human beings of vast intelligence, to the point where often these beings that have been called angels historically have to keep saying, don't be afraid. Why do they have to keep saying, don't be afraid? Because it's an overwhelming experience. So while we've tamed that and painted these images of childlike beings playing harps with wings, really, when you think about the way that the experiences were described, they're very overwhelming, much like, a gray alien or a reptilian or a giant mantis being. I'm not saying that's what they looked like specifically, but they were overwhelming. They were discombobulating to the people who experienced it, and also changed their life. You see people who say, who am I to be worthy of this? But I will give my life for this now, this calling that I feel. That's exactly how many people feel that have had encounters with these others. First, it's discombobulating, overwhelming, but they also feel this igniting of a sense of mission. Everybody that I know that I'm sort of on the same path with, we all feel that, like, this is why we're here. This intimate familiarity with this phenomenon is central to why we came here, why we're here, what we're here to do. Our business is not finished here until we fulfill something that is connected intimately to this phenomenon. And how is that not a religious experience? How is, like you say, has that not an ecstatic experience, much like religious history? And then I think about even hints that, the Catholic Church and the Vatican is well aware that these things that we call orbs now were part of ancient history and even more recent history. And you have notions like St. Francis of Assisi having bodily reactions that look like what we would call now a modern disease, which can just basically happen when you come into close contact with these orbs. So we have people like Colm Kelleher saying, well, these orbs look fun and exciting, but don't get too close, because not necessarily because they mean to, but they're just kind of radioactive. They're not good for our physiology to come into contact with. And this might be some of the very same things that were happening in religious history, but we put it in a different category. And it makes me think about the fact that some of the churches I was in my deep history, I noticed a distinct difference. There was sort of the more charismatic groups who were interested in having a real-time experience with something transcendent, something sublime and divine, right? And there was an expectation that was available. There were other religious groups, also Christian, who didn't like any of that notion. They wanted a very tame, safe, concretized, monumentized kind of thing that you put in a book, and it's safe because you can't change the book, right? And so you even see different personality types reflected in different kind of religious traditions. I think what many people will be shocked and in awe of in this case is that this is all happening in real time. This is not safe. This has not been put through tribunals like the Council of Nicaea and whatnot, where everybody sort of inherits this ancient tradition that's been, some people would say is ironed out a lot of the good stuff, but nevertheless, it's tame and it's safe. What we're confronted here is we are like those religious figures. We are Moses. We are Abraham, right? We are the Apostle Paul. We are these people having first century, if you will, even though it's the 21st century, experience with something that fundamentally changes perhaps the future trajectory of our civilization.
Yeah. We this is about us, right? This is about who we are. And I don't know, I can't help but think about that experience where what does it feel like to be truly known, to be fully known, to be laid bare, and to be revealed in a way that you've never been revealed before. Terrifying, yes. Scary, absolutely. Intimidating, definitely. But there's a degree of, as you said earlier, kind of trust that comes from that level of intimacy. And you can't help but also look at the entire enterprise and come away with a sense that this is about all of our journeys, right? This is about the journey of the development of the individual awareness of there's a lot of new age sort of mumbo jumbo that has been thrown around, but sort of what we are here to do, right? And as you talked about personality types and different personalities that are fixating on sort of the different aspects of our experience, I cannot help but evaluate the range of that behavior and come away going, yeah, like some of us are, we're here and we're really kind of trapped on the things. We just love the things, we just got here and everything's shiny and we love the shiny stuff. And then we have others that they get here and none of that stuff means anything. They don't care about that stuff at all. They care about how they treat other people, and they're giving things away. Possessions mean nothing to them. What we tend to look at those behaviors and create a kind of value scale. Oh, well, the people that are going for the shiny stuff, well, they're low class, they're underdeveloped. Like the people that are giving it all away, that's a higher developed. Well, maybe in some ways you can look at it that way, but the truth of it is, like, these are the steps that we all must go through. And I think, all that, kind of preamble there is to say that the acknowledgement, the onset of the phenomena in our world is an acknowledgement that there is much more to be done, that there is much more than just what is here. And when there is more to what is here, how does it change the entire paradigm of what you value, of what you spend your time on, what you spend your thoughts on, how you treat other individuals? Those are the things that I hear from a lot of experiencers, that it has changed the way that they have treated the world. They're much more conscious about their behavior. At least they certainly try to be. And so that's exactly what I would expect to happen if you are encountering a kind of intelligence like this that is representative of that deeper layer of reality. It's going to shatter into a million pieces the things that we tend to think are important. And we value so many stupid, silly, senseless things. And it's going to, I think, expose how stupid and silly those things are. And those of us that have been collecting them, we're going to feel pretty foolish, right? Oh, you're telling me right now that all this cool stuff that I've got behind me that I've accumulated doesn't mean anything? Like it's not important? Well, the world that I grew up in told me it was. So now I'm kind of dealing with an entire crisis that I have to navigate my way through. I feel like a lot of people are going to be stuck in that place, at least people in the West.
It's a good point about how experiences are changed, because if you think about this, perhaps this will provide the opportunity for many, many more people to fall into that category where they are confronted with notions that transcend their previous models of the world and provide the opportunity to actually embrace a new way of being. I think that something that really changed for me, and I know it's true for a lot of experiencers, is this notion that absolutely unquestionably, without a doubt, this lifetime is not all there is. And it almost being preposterous to think that that's the case. So once you really metabolize that part, the fact that this is just one chapter of many, then it's not about saying to people, come on, don't be so materialistic. Why do you want a Ferrari and a big house and a yacht? It's not about that. It's recognizing that, as you kind of hinted at there, those things don't really have meaning when the context changes, right? It's not that the things change, it's that the context changes. So if you see what we perceive as physical reality in this lifetime as actually just being a stage that has been set up to allow for the evolution of your consciousness, which carries on after this lifetime, that's been here before this lifetime, that in some ways is not even linear like that. That's part of the illusory nature of our experience. You have a multifaceted, multidimensional component to yourself. And again, I've had experiences where I'm feeling like I'm interacting with another intelligence and it actually feels like it's me. It feels like it's another aspect of me, right? So again, this gets very complex in terms of where do we end and they begin. But when you really have that shift in the perspective of the context, then it just follows that you look at things differently and you recognize that it would be a huge waste of your own time and energy if you got caught up in these toys, basically, when you realize that the whole point of being here was to grow your soul, for lack of a better term, and that's what you take with you. And so if you got caught up in these toys, then it's like, a 35-year-old who's still in the sandbox in the back of the house playing with like toy trucks. I mean, that's kind of cute, I guess, in a way, but it's actually kind of sad, right? It's like, maybe you need to move on. So failure to launch in the nth degree, right? So that's something I want to point out here, that it's not about trying to shame people into saying, be less materialistic. That's wrong. It's about recognizing that will naturally follow once you have this contextual shift and you're aware of the larger context. And I think that this will help do that for many people. And as I pointed out, I think in our last episode, one of the real fascinating questions for me is, what happens when hundreds of millions of people are trying CE5, right? What happens when people are aware that there are different kinds of entities all around us and you can actually proactively try to make contact, and it seems to work? Again, the number of people who practice CE5 or /HICE, human initiated contact events, and actually have not only encounters, but very often it's the case, it's positive encounters. So again, even that notion, right, that the way we prime the experience with positivity or negativity results in different kinds of experiences. People are going to have to metabolize that, right? That they are actually in a complex, multifaceted cosmos that's multidimensional, and that different beings are available to be contacted, but you have to be aware, you have to have spiritual hygiene, energetic hygiene to make sure that you're making the right kind of contact. In the same way that we're conscious of where we drive in the city at the middle of the night kind of thing, the same way you have to learn some protocols to follow. And this is going to be very, very new to people, right? This really makes you think about just how far-reaching this goes, because it not only do we become confronted with the fact there are others in our midst, but suddenly you have billions of people aware of that. And how does that change their behavior? And how does that change in behavior then change the entire civilization, change the nature of our relationship with reality?
Well, priming the experience, I have to, sort of explore how is the experience being primed right now? There's a lot of, and has been a lot of speculation in the UFO community for decades, of course, that there are the secret keepers, and there's going to be kind of a controlled disclosure. There's going to be a rollout. There's going to, the puppet master sort of, concept here. And I'm, aware here how keenly important priming the experience is, right? So how is the experience of this rollout being primed for humanity right now? I mean, it's pretty clear to me, looking at it, just unfold, and someone that has an interest in this, that it's the vector by which it's unfolding is very much through kind of the scientific inquiry, scientific method, academic understanding that kind of blinders on. These things are permitted. We're not going to talk about these things because they're not real. And so I'm wondering, here out loud, is that the best approach for this? How do we go from that kind of narrow materialist scientific, expectation setting to transition from there to what it really is, to the wider? How do we go from the nuts and bolts to the woo, as the sort of the perennial debate in the UFO community, right? We're not priming for woo at all right now, I don't think. And maybe that's because the woo is a lot harder. It's a lot more subjective. People have fewer answers there. If all we've done as a secret state has been studying, craft or debris and under a microscope, then of course we're going to roll this out from a nuts and bolts perspective. But on the other hand, there is evidence to show that agencies and individuals have studied some aspects of the woo for decades as well. It's just that maybe the answers are harder to distill and package for a materialist audience. So how do you think about all this? And in that, how do you think the revelation of what this is being primed for humanity at this moment?
It's a good question, and definitely, I think when we think about how this would roll out for instance, a shamanic culture, it would be very, very different. They already see this as part of reality, right? When Ross Coulthart spoke with Aborigines in Australia, they basically laughed and said, "You white people act like this is a new thing. We've known about these beings all along. We have a relationship with them." So for a group like that, it's not going to be nearly as daunting because it's already been metabolized. They're born with that kind of part of their culture. So as you say, in Western civilization, where we've truncated reality, where we've flat-landed everything so that we think that physical reality is all that really counts and everything else is mushy, subjective stuff that is ultimately just the byproduct of epiphenomenalistic firings of our brain, then this blows that entirely apart. But how do you take the first step? What does that look like? As we talked about, right now, there's this attempt to ground this in reality. And even if the secret keepers know darn well there's a there, they recognize they have to package this in such a way that the skeptics, the cynics, will actually have to acknowledge that something's going on that can't be explained. And in our culture, the way that looks is you present evidence that is objective, impartial, and difficult to disagree with. But as I've said before, I think one question that really comes to me around this, and I'm sure the secret keepers are wondering about this, is what will the response of the others be to this? Because they are not an inert force. They are an ever-present force that have been shaping things from behind the scenes, from behind the curtain. They've been the Wizard of Oz, if you will. So what happens when suddenly they become aware that we're aware of them? This is an interesting question. I don't think anyone knows the answer to it. And I also want to make this point because I always want to give this caveat because I think people otherwise think that I paint too rosy a picture of this entire thing. Again, there are entities out there that are not so friendly. There are entities out there that are not so evolved. And again, I think those go hand in hand. The higher your evolutionary consciousness is, the more you're connected to the sense of being connected to everything and everyone, and that changes your behavior. In the same way I talked about when you change the context of realizing this is just one iteration amongst many lifetimes, it automatically changes your relationship to reality. In the same way, the highest of these beings see themselves as connected to everyone and everything, and they don't want to dominate or suppress or colonize because that would be like doing that to themselves. So there are, again, entities, though, that are negative, that are more like viral, kind of parasitic kind of entities, and people will have to be aware of those. And the irony is those have already been working in our world, and we just haven't had a category for them. So even when you think about the psychological field, and I think about John Mack and what he had to run into in terms of saying to people, this really was not psychopathology. These people are completely healthy. This is a real part of reality. And some things that we quickly wanted to make mental illness issues were not something else. But what this shows us is that this really changes the menu, because you can have experiences that are positive that are not someone being delusional. In the same way, some people demonstrating negative behaviors, even self-defeating behaviors, might also be unfortunately suffering under some sort of parasitic entity that is not them, and it's not just something gone wrong in the neuronal connections of their brain. This can't be fixed by drugs. It's something fundamental about reality and the relationship with reality. And in fact, reality itself is kind of more energetic, and the physicality, again, is just illusory. And so that even changes our entire understanding of healthcare. How do we approach medicine when we realize that we are primarily energetic beings, and that our relationship with each other, with ourselves, with the greater cosmos has more to do with our health than anything to do with these much higher level things like drugs and medicines, that those are sort of last gasp ways of trying to address the issue that actually you can get at the root. So these are all the questions that come to mind. The more we talk about this tonight, the more I'm aware of all the different areas in our society that will be impacted by this. But for sure, one is just the fact that there's good and bad and everything in between. It's the full spectrum, and people are just not prepared to realize there even is a spectrum.
It's an incredible task, and I think that when moments happen like this, that they're happening at the right time in a way. I mean, as we talked about, of course, time is in many ways a pretty subjective thing, but the world really needs this, and I think to the tragedy that it has been hidden from us, that the truth has been suppressed in many ways, that we have traded our basest desires. We've doubled down on those, and we, instead of pursuing the deeper truths of reality. I mean, and how much time we may have wasted in generations we have wasted that have been chasing the wrong kinds of things. It represents this tremendous opportunity for change and transformation. And you could call me naive or too hopeful, optimistic, but I believe we could use a dash of that. I believe that our world needs that we'd be better off if we went down that path. And it's perhaps these other entities are, at least the ones that are benevolent or not out to get us in some in terrible way. They're rooting us on. They're rooting this entire endeavor on. They want to see this come to pass, because you can imagine if you were a parent and you were looking at your kids, doing terrible things, and you had the ability to step in and kind of stop them from continuing to behave that way. I mean, you would. It would be the right thing to do, not because you think like just intervening is going to mean that they're never going to make mistakes again, but your intervention is intervening at all. You're hoping to introduce a teachable moment where you can say, hey, if you continue doing this, you're going to not only hurt yourself, but you're going to hurt your siblings. You're going to hurt the others around you, and you're going to hurt the world around you. So pointing out, making them aware of the damage that they can do, is the responsible thing to do for someone that has that kind of greater perceptual awareness of what is going on. And so, I hope that the others are, many of the others are of that persuasion, that they are, kind of, rooting for this, that they will make themselves more known in a way that will lead to true transformation. I don't know. It's not going to be easy. That much I think we can pretty much guarantee. And there are no shortcuts either, right? We can't just, pop a pill here and go through the entire process. We've got to put in the work. And that may honestly be the hardest part of it all, right? Is this understanding that a press release isn't going to make you a better person. A press release isn't going to magically solve all of your problems. As much as you might crave just disclosure, there is still so much work left to be done. And I think so many people in the community are in absolute abject denial about that. They just think that this is going to be some sort of amazing, utopia whenever we get this pronouncement from on high. And I really think that that's only the beginning of the next very long chapter in the human story and in our individual stories of the things that we must do to change and transform ourselves.
Indeed, agreed, and that's a worthy note to end on.
Thank you for listening with us and spending time with us. We really appreciate all of the comments and shares and likes that we get on the show. This show is deeply meaningful to both Darren and I. I'm grateful for our friendship, and I'm grateful for those that we have met along the way, and know that we're going to meet new friends and colleagues. And as this conversation continues to expand, we hope that you be part of that. We hope that you decide to be an influence where you are, and be a voice for the good that can be done in the world. And may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.